Chapter 7 of The Permanent Husband by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He was in a great hurry to know all. In order to lose no time about finding out what he felt he must know at once, he told the coachman to drive straight to Trusotsky's rooms. On the way he changed his mind. Let him come to me himself, he thought, and meanwhile I can attend to my cursed law business. But today he really felt that he was too absent to attend to anything at all, and at 5 o'clock he set out with the intention of dining. And at this moment, for the first time, an amusing idea struck him. What if he really only hindered his law business by meddling as he did, and hunting his wretched lawyer about the place, when the latter plainly avoided meeting him? Velchaninoff laughed merrily over this idea. And yet, he thought, if this notion had struck me in the evening instead of now, how angry I should have been. He laughed again, more merrily than before. But in spite of his merriness, he grew more and more thoughtful and impatient, and could settle to nothing, nor could he think out what he most wanted to reflect upon. "I must have that fellow here," he said at length. "I must read the mystery of him first of all, and then I can settle what to do next. There's a duel in this business." Returning home at 7 o'clock he did not find Pavel Pavlovitch there, which fact first surprised him, then angered him, then depressed him, and at last frightened him. God knows how it will all end," he cried, first trying to settle himself on a sofa, and then marching up and down the room, and all the while looking at his watch every other minute. At length, about 9 o'clock, Pavel Pavlovitch appeared. If this man was cunning enough to mean it, he could not have managed better in order to put me into a state of nervousness, thought Velchaninoff, though his heart bounded for joy to see his guest arrive. To Velchaninoff's cordial inquiry as to why he was so late, Pavel Pavlovitch smiled disagreeably, took a seat with easy familiarity, carelessly threw his crape-bound hat on a chair, and made himself perfectly at home. Velchaninoff observed and took stock of the careless manner adopted by his visitor. It was not like yesterday. Velchaninoff then quietly, and in a few words, gave Pavel Pavlovitch an account of what he had done with Liza, of how kindly she had been received, of how good it would be for the child down there. Then he led the conversation to the topic of the Pogoryeltseffs, leaving Liza out of the talking altogether, and spoke of how kind the whole family were, of how long he had known them, and so on. Pavel Pavlovitch listened absently, occasionally looking ironically at his host from under his eyelashes. "What an enthusiast you are!" he muttered at last, smiling very unpleasantly. You seem in a bad humour to-day," remarked Velchaninoff with annoyance. "And why shouldn't I be as wicked as my neighbours?" cried Pavel Pavlovitch suddenly. He said this so abruptly that he gave one the idea that he had pounced out of a corner where he had been lurking, on purpose to make a dash at the first opportunity. "Oh, dear me! Do as you like, pray!" laughed Velchaninoff. "I only thought something had put you out, perhaps." "So it has!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, as though proud of the fact. "Well, what was it?" Pavel Pavlovitch waited a moment or two before he replied. "Why, it's that Stepan Michailovitch Bagantoff of ours, up to his tricks again. He's a shining light among the highest circles of society, he is." "Wouldn't he receive you again, or what?" "No, not quite that, this time. On the contrary, I was allowed to go in for the first time on record, and I had the honour of musing over his features, too. But he happened to be a corpse, that's all." "What? Bagantoff dead?" cried Velchaninoff, in the greatest astonishment, though there was no particular reason why he should be surprised. "Yes, my unalterable, 6 years' standing friend is dead. Died yesterday at about midday, and I knew nothing of it. Perhaps he died just when I called there, who knows? To-morrow is the funeral. He's in his coffin at this moment. Died of nervous fever, and they let me in to see him, they did indeed, to contemplate his features. I told them I was a great friend, and therefore they allowed me in. A pretty trick he has played me, this dear friend of 6 years' standing. Why, perhaps I came to St. Petersburg specially for him." "Well, it's hardly worth your while to be angry with him about it, is it? He didn't die on purpose," said Velchaninoff, laughing. "Oh, but I'm speaking out of pure sympathy. He was a dear friend to me, oh, a very dear friend." Pavel Pavlovitch gave a smile of detestable irony and cunning. "Do you know what, Alexey Ivanovitch?" he resumed. "I think you ought to treat me to something. I have often treated you. I used to be your host every blessed day, sir, at tea, for a whole year. Send for a bottle of wine, do, my throat is so dry." "With pleasure. Why didn't you say so before? What would you like?" "Don't say you, say we. We'll drink together, of course," said Pavel Pavlovitch defiantly, but at the same time looking into Velchaninoff's eyes with some concern. "Shall it be champagne?" "Of course. It isn't time for vodka yet." Velchaninoff rose slowly, rang the bell, and gave Mavra the necessary orders. "We'll drink to this happy meeting of friends after 9 years' parting," said Pavel Pavlovitch, with a very inappropriate and unnecessary giggle. "Why, you are the only real, true friend left to me now. Bagantoff is no more. It quite reminds one of the great poet, 'Great Patroclus is no more, mean Thersites liveth yet,' and so on, don't you know?" At the name Thersites, Pavel Pavlovitch touched his own breast. "I wish you would speak plainly, you pig of a fellow," said Velchaninoff to himself. "I hate hints." His own anger was on the rise, and he had long been struggling with his self-restraint. "Look here, tell me this, since you consider Bagantoff to have been guilty before you, as I see you do, surely you must be glad that your betrayer is dead? What are you so angry about?" "Glad? Why should I be glad?" "I judge by what I should imagine your feelings to be. Ha! Well, this time you are a little bit in error as to my feelings, for once. A certain sage has said, 'My good enemy is dead, but I have a still better one alive.' Ha ha! Well, but you saw him alive for 5 years at a stretch. I should have thought that was enough to contemplate his features in," said Velchaninoff angrily and contemptuously. "Yes, but how was I to know then, sir?" snapped Pavel Pavlovitch, jumping out of an ambush once more, as it were, delighted to be asked a question which he had long awaited. "Why, what do you take me for, Alexey Ivanovitch?" At this moment there was in the speaker's face a new expression altogether, transfiguring entirely the hitherto merely disagreeably malicious look upon it. "Do you mean to say you knew nothing of it?" said Velchaninoff in astonishment. "How? Didn't know? As if I could have known it and— Oh, you race of Jupiters! You reckon a man to be no better than a dog, and judge of him by your own sentiments. Look here, sir. There, look at that!" So saying, he brought his fist madly down upon the table with a resounding bang, and immediately afterwards looked frightened at his own act. Velchaninoff's face beamed. "Listen, Pavel Pavlovitch," he said. "It is entirely the same thing to me whether you knew or did not know all about it. If you did not know, so much the more honorable is it for you. But I can't understand why you should have selected me for your confidant." "I wasn't talking of you. Don't be angry. It wasn't about you," muttered Pavel Pavlovitch, with his eyes fixed on the ground. At this moment Mavra entered with the champagne. "Here it is!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, immensely delighted at the appearance of the wine. "Now then, tumblers, my good girl, tumblers, quick! Capital! Thank you, we don't require you any more, my good Mavra. What? You've drawn the cork? Excellent creature! Well, ta-ta! Off with you!" Mavra's advent with the bottle so encouraged him that he again looked at Velchaninoff with some defiance. "Now confess," he giggled suddenly, "confess that you are very curious indeed to hear about all this, and that it is by no means 'entirely the same to you,' as you declared. Confess that you would be miserable if I were to get up and go away this very minute without telling you anything more." "Not the least in the world, I assure you." Pavel Pavlovitch smiled, and his smile said, as plainly as words could, "That's a lie." "Well, let's to business," he said, and poured out 2 glasses of champagne. "Here's a toast," he continued, raising his goblet, "to the health in paradise of our dear departed friend Bagantoff." He raised his glass and drank. "I won't drink such a toast as that," said Velchaninoff, and put his glass down on the table. "Why not? It's a very pretty toast." "Look here, were you drunk when you came here?" "A little. Why?" "Oh, nothing particular. Only it appeared to me that yesterday, and especially this morning, you were sincerely sorry for the loss of Natalia Vasilievna." "And who says I am not sorry now?" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, as if somebody had pulled a string and made him snap the words out, like a doll. "No, I don't mean that, but you must admit you may be in error about Bagantoff, and that's a serious matter." Pavel Pavlovitch grinned and gave a wink. "Hey, wouldn't you just like to know how I found out about Bagantoff, eh?" Velchaninoff blushed. "I repeat, it's all the same to me," he said, and added to himself, "Hadn't I better pitch him and the bottle out of the window together?" He was blushing more and more now. Pavel Pavlovitch poured himself out another glass. "I'll tell you directly how I found out all about Mr. Bagantoff, and your burning wish shall be satisfied. For you are a fiery sort of man, you know, Alexey Ivanovitch. Oh, dreadfully so! Ha ha! Just give me a cigarette first, will you? For ever since March—" "Here's a cigarette for you." "Ever since March I have been a depraved man, sir, and this is how it all came about. Listen. Consumption, as you know, my dear friend," Pavel Pavlovitch was growing more and more familiar, "is an interesting malady. One sees a man dying of consumption without a suspicion that tomorrow is to be his last day. Well, I told you how Natalia Vasilievna, up to 5 hours before her death, talked about going to visit her aunt, who lived 30 miles or so away, and starting in a fortnight. You know how some ladies—and gentlemen too, I dare say—have the bad habit of keeping a lot of old rubbish by them, in the way of love letters and so on. It would be much safer to stick them all into the fire, wouldn't it? But no, they must keep every little scrap of paper in drawers and desks, and endorse it and classify it, and tie it up in bundles, for each year and month and class. I don't know whether they find this consoling to their feelings afterwards or what. Well, since she was arranging a visit to her aunt just 5 hours before her death, Natalia Vasilievna naturally did not expect to die so soon. In fact, she was expecting old Dr. Koch down till the last; and so, when Natalia Vasilievna did die, she left behind her a beautiful little black desk all inlaid with mother of pearl, and bound with silver, in her bureau. Oh, a lovely little box, an heirloom left her by her grandmother, with a lock and key all complete. Well, sir, in this box everything, I mean everything, you know, for every day and hour for the last 20 years, was disclosed. And since Mr. Bagantoff had a decided taste for literature—indeed, he had published a passionate novel once, I am told, in a newspaper—consequently, there were about 100 examples of his genius in the desk, ranging over a period of 5 years. Some of these talented effusions were covered with pencilled remarks by Natalia Vasilievna herself. Pleasant that, for a fond husband's feelings, sir, eh?" Velchaninoff quickly cast his thoughts back over the past, and remembered that he had never written a single letter or a single note to Natalia Vasilievna. He had written a couple of letters from St. Petersburg, but, according to a previous arrangement, he had addressed them to both Mr. and Mrs. Trusotsky together. He had not answered Natalia Vasilievna's last letter, which had contained his dismissal, at all. Having ended his speech, Pavel Pavlovitch relapsed into silence, and sat smiling repulsively for a whole minute or so. "Why don't you answer my question, my friend?" he asked at length, evidently disturbed by Velchaninoff's silence. "What question?" "As to the pleasure I must have felt as a fond husband upon opening the desk." "Your feelings are no business of mine," said the other bitterly, rising and commencing to stride up and down the room. "I wouldn't mind betting that you were thinking at this very moment what a pig of a fellow he is to parade his shame like this. Ha! Dear me, what a squeamish gentleman you are, to be sure!" "Not at all. I was thinking nothing of the sort. On the contrary, I consider that you are, besides being more or less intoxicated, so put out by the death of the man who has injured you, that you are not yourself. There's nothing surprising in it at all. I quite understand why you wish Bagantoff were still alive, and I am ready to respect your annoyance, but—" "And pray why do you suppose that I wish Bagantoff were alive?" "Oh, that's your affair." "I'll take my oath you are thinking of a duel." "Devil take it, sir!" cried Velchaninoff, obliged to hold himself tighter than ever. "I was thinking that you, like every respectable person in similar circumstances, would act openly and candidly and straightforwardly, and not humiliate yourself with comical antics and silly grimaces, and ridiculous complaints and detestable innuendoes, which only heap greater shame upon you. I say I was thinking you would act like a respectable person." "Ha, ha! But perhaps I am not a respectable person." "Oh, well, that's your own affair again, and yet, if so, what in the devil's name could you want with Bagantoff alive?" "Oh, my dear sir, I should have liked just to have a nice peep at a dear old friend, that's all. We should have got hold of a bottle of wine, and drunk it together." "He wouldn't have drunk with you." "Why not? Noblesse oblige. Why, you are drinking with me. Wherein is he better than you?" "I have not drunk with you." "Wherefore this sudden pride, sir?" Velchaninoff suddenly burst into a fit of nervous, irritable laughter. "Why, deuce take it all!" he cried, "you are quite a different type to what I believed. I thought you were nothing but a permanent husband, but I find you are a sort of bird of prey." "What permanent husband? What is a permanent husband?" asked Pavel Pavlovitch, pricking up his ears. "Oh, just one type of husbands, that's all. It's too long to explain. Come, you'd better get out now, it's quite time you went. I'm sick of you." "And bird of prey, sir, what did that mean?" "I said you were a bird of prey for a joke." "Yes, but bird of prey! Tell me what you mean, Alexey Ivanovitch, for goodness' sake." "Come, come, that's quite enough!" shouted Velchaninoff, suddenly flaring up and speaking at the top of his voice. "It's time you went. Get out of this, will you?" "No, sir, it's not enough!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, jumping up too. "Even if you are sick of me, sir, it's not enough. For you must first drink and clink glasses with me. I won't go before you do. No, no, oh dear no. Drink first. It's not enough yet." "Pavel Pavlovitch, will you go to the devil or will you not?" "With pleasure, sir. I'll go to the devil with pleasure. But first we must drink. You say you don't wish to drink with me, but I wish you to drink with me, actually with me." Pavel Pavlovitch was grimacing and giggling no longer. He seemed to be suddenly transfigured again, and was as different from the Pavel Pavlovitch of but a few moments since as he could possibly be, both in appearance and in the tone of his voice; so much so that Velchaninoff was absolutely confounded. "Come, Alexey Ivanovitch, let's drink. Don't refuse me," continued Pavel Pavlovitch, seizing the other tightly by the hand, and gazing into his face with an extraordinary expression. It was clear there was more in this matter than the mere question of drinking a glass of wine. "Well," muttered Velchaninoff, "but that's nothing but dregs." "No, there's just a couple of glasses left, it's quite clear. Now then, clink glasses and drink. There, I'll take your glass and you take mine." They touched glasses and drank. "Oh, Alexey Ivanovitch, now that we've drunk together, oh!" Pavel Pavlovitch suddenly raised his hand to his forehead and sat still for a few moments. Velchaninoff trembled with excitement. He thought Pavel Pavlovitch was about to disclose all. But Pavel Pavlovitch said nothing whatever. He only looked at him, and quietly smiled his detestable cunning smile in the other's face. "What do you want with me, you drunken wretch?" cried Velchaninoff, furious, and stamping his foot upon the floor. "You are making a fool of me!" "Don't shout so, don't shout! Why make such a noise?" cried Pavel Pavlovitch. "I'm not making a fool of you. Do you know what you are to me now?" And he suddenly seized Velchaninoff's hand and kissed it before Velchaninoff could recollect himself. "There, that's what you are to me now. And now I'll go to the devil." "Wait a bit, stop!" cried Velchaninoff, recollecting himself. "There's something I wish to say to you." Pavel Pavlovitch turned back from the door. "You see," began Velchaninoff, blushing and keeping his eye well away from the other, "you ought to go with me to the Pogoryeltseffs to-morrow, just to thank them, you know, and make their acquaintance." Of course, quite so," said Pavel Pavlovitch readily, and making a gesture of the hand to imply that he knew his duty, and there was no need to remind him of it. "Besides, Liza expects you anxiously. I promised her." "Liza?" Pavel Pavlovitch turned quickly once more upon him. "Liza? Do you know, sir, what this Liza has been to me, has been and is?" he cried passionately and almost beside himself. "But, no, afterwards. That shall be afterwards. Meanwhile, it's not enough for me, Alexey Ivanovitch, that we have drunk together. There's another satisfaction I must have, sir." He placed his hat on a chair, and, panting with excitement, gazed at his companion with much the same expression as before. "Kiss me, Alexey Ivanovitch." "Are you drunk?" cried the other, drawing back. "Yes, I am. But kiss me all the same, Alexey Ivanovitch. Oh, do! I kissed your hand just now, you know." Alexey Ivanovitch was silent for a few moments, as though stunned by the blow of a cudgel. Then he quickly bent down to Pavel Pavlovitch, who was about the height of his shoulder, and kissed his lips, from which proceeded a disagreeably powerful odour of wine. He performed the action as though not quite certain of what he was doing. "Well, now!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch with drunken enthusiasm, and with his eyes flashing fiercely. "Now, look here, I'll tell you what I thought at that time. Surely not he, too, if this man, I thought, if this man is guilty too, then whom am I ever to trust again?" Pavel Pavlovitch suddenly burst into tears. "So now you must understand how dear a friend you are to me henceforth." With these words he took his hat and rushed out of the room. Velchaninoff stood for several minutes in one spot, just as he had done after Pavel Pavlovitch's first visit. "It's merely a drunken sally, nothing more," he muttered. "Absolutely nothing further," he repeated, when he was undressed and settled down in his bed. Chapter 8 of The Permanent Husband, by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Next morning, while waiting for Pavel Pavlovitch, who had promised to be in good time in order to drive down to the Pogoryeltseffs with him, Velchaninoff walked up and down the room, sipped his coffee, and every other minute reflected upon one and the same idea, namely, that he felt like a man who had awakened from sleep with the deep impression of having received a box on the ear the last thing at night. He thought anxiously, he understands the state of the case only too well. He'll take it out of me by means of Liza. The dear image of the poor little girl danced before his eyes. His heart beat quicker when he reflected that to-day, in a couple of hours, he would see his own Liza once more. "Yes, there's no question about it," he said to himself. "My whole end and aim in life is there now. What do I care about all these memories and boxes on the ear, and what have I lived for up to now? For sorrow and discomfort, that's all, But now, it's all different. But in spite of his ecstatic feelings, he grew more and more thoughtful. He is worrying me for Liza, that's plain. And he bullies Liza. He is going to take it out of me that way, for all. At all events, I cannot possibly allow such sallies as his of last night. And Velchaninoff blushed hotly. And here's 11:30 and he hasn't come yet. He waited long, till 12:30, and his anguish of impatience grew more and more keen. Pavel Pavlovitch did not appear. At length the idea began to take shape that Pavel Pavlovitch naturally would not come again for the sole purpose of another scene like that of last night. The thought filled Velchaninoff with despair. The brute knows I am depending upon him, and what on earth am I to do now about Liza? How can I make my appearance without him? At last he could bear it no longer, and set off to the Pokrovsky at 1 o'clock to look for Pavel Pavlovitch. At the lodging, Velchaninoff was informed that Pavel Pavlovitch had not been at home all night, and had only called in at 9 o'clock, stayed a quarter of an hour, and had gone out again. Velchaninoff stood at the door listening to the servant's report, mechanically tried the handle, recollected himself, and asked to see Maria Sisevna. The latter obeyed his summons at once. She was a kind-hearted old creature, of generous feelings, as Velchaninoff described her afterwards to Claudia Petrovna. Having first inquired as to his journey yesterday with Liza, Maria launched into anecdotes of Pavel Pavlovitch. She declared that she would long ago have turned her lodger out neck and crop, but for the child. Pavel Pavlovitch had been turned out of the hotel for general disreputable behavior. "Oh, he does dreadful things," she continued. "Fancy telling the poor child in anger that she wasn't his daughter, but—" "Oh, no, no! Impossible!" cried Velchaninoff in alarm. "I heard it myself. She's only a small child, of course, but that sort of thing doesn't do before an intelligent child like her." She cried dreadfully. She was quite upset. "We had a catastrophe in the house, a short while since. Some commissionaire or somebody took a room in the evening, and hung himself before morning. He had bolted with money, they say. Well, crowds of people came in to stare at him. Pavel Pavlovitch wasn't at home, but the child had escaped and was wandering about, and she must needs go with the rest to see the sight. I saw her looking at the suicide with an extraordinary expression, and carried her off at once, of course. And fancy, I hardly managed to get home with her, trembling all over she was, when off she goes in a dead faint, and it was all I could do to bring her round at all. I don't know whether she's epileptic or what, and ever since that she has been ill. When her father heard, he came and pinched her all over. He doesn't beat her, he always pinches her like that. Then he went out and got drunk somewhere, and came back and frightened her. 'I'm going to hang myself too,' he says, 'because of you. I shall hang myself on that blind string there,' he says, and he makes a loop in the string before her very eyes. The poor little thing went quite out of her mind with terror, and cried and clasped him round with her little arms. 'I'll be good, I'll be good,' she shrieks. It was a pitiful sight, it was indeed." Velchaninoff, though prepared for strange revelations concerning Pavel Pavlovitch and his ways, was quite dumbfounded by these tales. He could scarcely believe his ears. Maria Sisevna told him many more such little anecdotes. Among others, there was one occasion when, if she, Maria, had not been by, Liza would have thrown herself out of the window. Pavel Pavlovitch had come staggering out of the room muttering, "I shall smash her head in with a stick, I shall murder her like a dog," and he had gone away, repeating this over and over again to himself. Velchaninoff hired a carriage, and set off toward the Pogoryeltseffs. Before he had left the town behind him, the carriage was delayed by a block at a cross-road, just by a small bridge, over which was passing, at the moment, a long funeral procession. There were carriages waiting to move on both sides of the bridge, and a considerable crowd of foot passengers besides. The funeral was evidently of some person of considerable importance, for the train of private and hired vehicles was a very long one, and at the window of one of these carriages in the procession Velchaninoff suddenly beheld the face of Pavel Pavlovitch. Velchaninoff would not have believed his eyes, but that Pavel Pavlovitch nodded his head and smiled to him. He seemed to be delighted to have recognized Velchaninoff. He even began to kiss his hand out of the window. Velchaninoff jumped out of his own vehicle, and in spite of policemen, crowd, and everything else, elbowed his way to Pavel Pavlovitch's carriage window. He found the latter sitting alone. "What are you doing?" he cried. "Why didn't you come to my house? Why are you here?" "I'm paying a debt. Don't shout so. I'm repaying a debt," said Pavel Pavlovitch, giggling and winking. "I'm escorting the mortal remains of my dear friend, Stepan Mikhailovitch Bagantoff." "What absurdity, you drunken, insane creature!" cried Velchaninoff, louder than ever, and beside himself with outraged feeling. "Get out and come with me, quick! Get out instantly!" "I can't. It's a debt." "I'll put you out then!" shouted Velchaninoff. "Then I'll scream, sir, I'll scream!" giggled Pavel Pavlovitch as merrily as ever, just as though the whole thing was a joke. However, he retreated into the further corner of the carriage, all the same. "Look out, sir, look out! You'll be knocked down!" cried a policeman. Sure enough, an outside carriage was making its way on to the bridge from the side, stopping the procession and causing a commotion. Velchaninoff was obliged to spring aside, and the press of carriages and people immediately separated him from Pavel Pavlovitch. He shrugged his shoulders and returned to his own vehicle. "It's all the same, I couldn't take such a fellow with me anyhow," he reflected, still all of a tremble with excitement and the rage of disgust. When he repeated Maria Sisevna's story, and his meeting at the funeral, to Claudia Petrovna afterwards, the latter became buried in deep thought. "I am anxious for you," she said at last. "You must break off all relations with that man, and as soon as possible." "Oh, he's nothing but a drunken fool!" cried Velchaninoff passionately. "As if I am to be afraid of him! And how can I break off relations with him? Remember Liza!" Meanwhile Liza was lying ill. Fever had set in last night, and an eminent doctor was momentarily expected from town. He had been sent for early this morning. This news quite upset Velchaninoff. Claudia Petrovna took him in to see the patient. "I observed her very carefully yesterday," she said, stopping at the door of Liza's room before entering it. "She is a proud and morose child. She is ashamed of being with us, and of having been thrown over by her father. In my opinion that is the whole secret of her illness." "How thrown over? Why do you suppose that he has thrown her over?" "The simple fact that he allowed her to come here to a strange house, and with a man who was also a stranger, or nearly so; or, at all events, with whom his relations were such that——" "Oh, but I took her myself, almost by force." Liza was not surprised to see Velchaninoff alone. She only smiled bitterly, and turned her hot face to the wall. She made no reply to his passionate promises to bring her father down to-morrow without fail, or to his timid attempts at consolation. As soon as Velchaninoff left the sick child's presence, he burst into tears. The doctor did not arrive until evening. On seeing the patient, he frightened everybody by his very first remark, observing that it was a pity he had not been sent for before. When informed that the child had only been taken ill last night, he could not believe it at first. "Well, it all depends upon how this night is passed," he decided at last. Having made all necessary arrangements, he took his departure, promising to come as early as possible next morning. Velchaninoff was anxious to stay the night, but Claudia Petrovna begged him to try once more to bring down that brute of a man. "Try once more!" cried Velchaninoff passionately. "Why, I'll tie him hand and foot, and bring him along myself." The idea that he would tie Pavel Pavlovitch up and carry him down in his arms overpowered Velchaninoff, and filled him with impatience to execute his frantic desire. "I don't feel the slightest bit guilty before him any more," he said to Claudia Petrovna at parting. "And I withdraw all my servile, abject words of yesterday, all I said to you," he said wrathfully. Liza lay with closed eyes, apparently asleep. She seemed to be better. When Velchaninoff bent cautiously over in order to kiss, if it were but the edge of her bed linen, she suddenly opened her eyes, just as though she had been waiting for him, and whispered, "Take me away." It was but a quiet, sad petition, without a trace of yesterday's irritation; but at the same time there was that in her voice which betrayed that she made the request in the full knowledge that it could not be assented to. No sooner did Velchaninoff, in despair, begin to assure her as tenderly as he could that what she desired was impossible, than she silently closed her eyes and said not another word, just as though she neither saw nor heard him. Arrived in town, Velchaninoff told his man to drive him to the Pokrofsky. It was 10 o'clock at night. Pavel Pavlovitch was not at his lodgings. Velchaninoff waited for him half an hour, walking up and down the passage in a state of feverish impatience. Maria Sisevna assured him at last that Pavel Pavlovitch would not come in until the small hours. "Well, then, I'll return here before daylight," he said, beside himself with desperation, and he went home to his own rooms. What was his amazement, when, on arriving at the gate of his house, he learned from Mavra that yesterday's visitor had been waiting for him ever since before 10 o'clock. "He's had some tea," she added, "and sent me for wine again, the same wine as yesterday. He gave me the money to buy it with." Chapter 9 of The Permanent Husband, by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pavel Pavlovitch had made himself very comfortable. He was sitting in the same chair as he had occupied yesterday, smoking a cigar, and had just poured the fourth and last tumbler of champagne out of the bottle. The teapot and a half-emptied tumbler of tea stood on the table beside him. His red face beamed with benevolence. He had taken off his coat, and sat in his shirt-sleeves. "Forgive me, dearest of friends!" he cried, catching sight of Velchaninoff, and hastening to put on his coat. "I took it off to make myself thoroughly comfortable." Velchaninoff approached him menacingly. "You are not quite tipsy yet, are you? Can you understand what is said to you?" Pavel Pavlovitch became a little confused. "No, not quite. I've been thinking of the dear deceased a bit, but I'm not quite drunk yet." "Can you understand what I say?" "My dear sir, I came here on purpose to understand you." "Very well, then, I shall begin at once by telling you that you are an ass, sir!" cried Velchaninoff at the top of his voice. "Why, if you begin that way, where will you end, I wonder?" said Pavel Pavlovitch, clearly alarmed more than a little. Velchaninoff did not listen, but roared again. "Your daughter is dying. She is very ill. Have you thrown her over altogether, or not?" "Oh, surely she isn't dying yet?" "I tell you she's ill, very, very ill, dangerously ill." "What, fits, or—" "Don't talk nonsense. I tell you she is very dangerously ill. You ought to go down, if only for that reason." "What, to thank your friends, eh? To return thanks for their hospitality? Of course, quite so. I well understand, Alexey Ivanovitch, dearest of friends." He suddenly seized Velchaninoff by both hands, and added with intoxicated sentiment, almost melted to tears, "Alexey Ivanovitch, don't shout at me, don't shout at me, please! If you do, I may throw myself into the Neva, I don't know. And we have such important things to talk over. There's lots of time to go to the Pogoryeltseffs another day." Velchaninoff did his best to restrain his wrath. "You are drunk, and therefore I don't understand what you are driving at," he said sternly. "I'm ready to come to an explanation with you at any moment you like. Delighted! The sooner the better. But first let me tell you that I am going to take my own measures to secure you. You will sleep here tonight, and tomorrow I shall take you with me to see Liza. I shall not let you go again. I shall bind you, if necessary, and carry you down myself. How do you like this sofa to sleep on?" he added, panting, and indicating a wide soft divan opposite his own sofa, against the other wall. "Oh, anything will do for me." "Very well, you shall have this sofa. Here, take these things. Here are sheets, blankets, pillow." Velchaninoff pulled these things out of a cupboard and tossed them impatiently to Pavel Pavlovitch, who humbly stood and received them. "Now then, make your bed. Come, bustle up." Pavel Pavlovitch, laden with bedclothes, had been standing in the middle of the room with a stupid drunken leer on his face, irresolute. But at Velchaninoff's second bidding he hurriedly began the task of making his bed, moving the table away from in front of it, and smoothing a sheet over the seat of the divan. Velchaninoff approached to help him. He was more or less gratified with his guest's alarm and submission. "Now drink up that wine and lie down," was his next command. He felt that he must order this man about; he could not help himself. "I suppose you took upon yourself to order this wine, did you?" I did, sir. I sent for the wine, Alexey Ivanovitch, because I knew you would not send out again." "Well, it's a good thing you knew that, but I desire that you should know still more. I give you notice that I have taken my own measures for the future. I'm not going to put up with any more of your antics." "Oh, I quite understand, Alexey Ivanovitch, that sort of thing could only happen once," said Pavel Pavlovitch, giggling feebly. At this reply Velchaninoff, who had been marching up and down the room, stopped solemnly before Pavel Pavlovitch. "Pavel Pavlovitch," he said, "speak plainly. You are a clever fellow, I admit the fact freely; but I assure you, you are going on a false track now. Speak plainly, and act like an honest man, and I give you my word of honour that I will answer all you wish to know." Pavel Pavlovitch grinned his disagreeable grin, which always drove Velchaninoff wild, once more. "Wait!" cried the latter. "No humbug now, please. I see through you. I repeat that I give you my word of honour to reply candidly to anything you may like to ask, and to give you every sort of satisfaction, reasonable or even unreasonable, that you please. Oh, how I wish I could make you understand me!" "Since you are so very kind," began Pavel Pavlovitch, cautiously bending towards him, "I may tell you that I am very much interested as to what you said yesterday about 'bird of prey.'" Velchaninoff spat on the ground in utter despair and disgust, and recommenced his walk up and down the room, quicker than ever. "No, no, Alexey Ivanovitch, don't spurn my question. You don't know how interested I am in it. I assure you, I came here on purpose to ask you about it. I know I'm speaking indistinctly, but you'll forgive me that. I've read the expression before. Tell me now, was Bagantoff a 'bird of prey' or the other thing? How is one to distinguish one from the other?" Velchaninoff went on walking up and down, and answered nothing for some minutes. "The bird of prey, sir," he began suddenly, stopping in front of Pavel Pavlovitch, and speaking vehemently, "is the man who would poison Bagantoff while drinking champagne with him under the cloak of good fellowship, as you did with me yesterday, instead of escorting his wretched body to the burial ground as you did. The deuce only knows why, and with what dirty, mean, underhanded, petty motives, which only recoil upon yourself and make you viler than you already are. Yes, sir, recoil upon yourself." "Quite so, I oughtn't to have gone," assented Pavel Pavlovitch, "but aren't you a little——" "The bird of prey is not a man who goes and learns his grievance off by heart like a lesson and whines it about the place, grimacing and posing, and hanging it round other people's necks, and who spends all his time in such pettifogging. Is it true you wanted to hang yourself? Come, is it true or not?" I don't know. I may have when I was drunk. I don't remember. You see, Alexey Ivanovitch, it wouldn't be quite nice for me to go poisoning people. I'm too high up in the service, and I have money too, you know, and I may wish to marry again. Who knows?" "Yes, you'd be sent to Siberia, which would be awkward." quite so, though they say the penal servitude is not so bad as it was. But you remind me of an anecdote, Alexey Ivanovitch. I thought of it in the carriage, and I meant to tell you afterwards. Well, you may remember Litzov at tea. He came while you were there. His younger brother, who is rather a swell too, was serving at L, under the governor. And one fine day he happened to quarrel with Colonel Golubenko in the presence of ladies, and of one lady especially. Litzov considered himself insulted, but concealed his grievance. And meanwhile Golubenko proposed to a certain lady and was accepted. Would you believe it, Litzov made great friends with Golubenko, and even volunteered to be best man at his wedding. But when the ceremony was over, and Litzov approached the bridegroom to wish him joy and kiss him, as usual, he took the opportunity of sticking a knife into Golubenko. Fancy! His own best man stuck him. Well, what does the assassin do but run about the room crying, "Oh, what have I done? Oh, what have I done?" says he, and throws himself on everyone's neck by turns, ladies and all. Ha ha ha! He starved to death in Siberia, sir. One is a little sorry for Golubenko, but he recovered after all. I don't understand why you told me that story, said Velchaninoff, frowning heavily. Why? Because he stuck the other fellow with a knife, giggled Pavel Pavlovitch, which proves that he was no type, but an ass of a fellow, who could so forget the ordinary manners of society as to hang around ladies' necks, and in the presence of the governor, too. And yet he stuck the other fellow. Ha ha ha! He did what he intended to do, that's all, sir. Go to the devil, will you? You and your miserable humbug. You miserable humbug yourself! Yelled Velchaninoff, wild with rage and fury, and panting so that he could hardly get his words out. You think you are going to alarm me, do you, you frightener of children, you mean beast, you low scoundrel, you! Scoundrel, scoundrel, scoundrel! He had quite forgotten himself in his rage. Pavel Pavlovitch shuddered all over. His drunkenness seemed to vanish in an instant. His lips trembled and shook. "Are you calling me a scoundrel, Alexey Ivanovitch? You? Me?" But Velchaninoff was himself again now. "I apologize, if you like," he said, and relapsed into gloomy silence. After a moment he added, "But only on condition that you yourself agree to speak out fully, and at once." "In your place I should apologize unconditionally, Alexey Ivanovitch." "Very well, so be it then." Velchaninoff was silent again for a while. "I apologize," he resumed, "but admit yourself, Pavel Pavlovitch, that I need not feel myself in any way bound to you after this. I mean with regard to anything, not only this particular matter." "All right. Why, what is there to settle between us?" laughed Pavel Pavlovitch, without looking up. "In that case, so much the better, so much the better. Come, drink up your wine and get into bed, for I shall not let you go now, anyhow." "Oh, my wine! Never mind my wine," muttered Pavel Pavlovitch, but he went to the table all the same, and took up his tumbler of champagne, which had long been poured out. Either he had been drinking copiously before, or there was some other unknown cause at work, but his hand shook so, as he drank the wine, that a quantity of it was spilled over his waistcoat and the floor. However, he drank it all, to the last drop, as though he could not leave the tumbler without emptying it. He then placed the empty glass on the table, approached his bed, sat down on it, and began to undress. "I think perhaps I had better not sleep here," he said suddenly, with one boot off, and half undressed. "Well, I don't think so," said Velchaninoff, who was walking up and down, without looking at him. Pavel Pavlovitch finished undressing and lay down. A quarter of an hour later Velchaninoff also got into bed, and put the candle out. He soon began to doze uncomfortably. Some new trouble seemed to have suddenly come over him and worried him, and at the same time he felt a sensation of shame that he could allow himself to be worried by the new trouble. Velchaninoff was just falling definitely asleep, however, when a rustling sound awoke him. He immediately glanced at Pavel Pavlovitch's bed. The room was quite dark, the blinds being down and curtains drawn, but it seemed to him that Pavel Pavlovitch was not lying in his bed. He seemed to be sitting on the side of it. "What's the matter?" cried Velchaninoff. "A ghost, sir," said Pavel Pavlovitch in a low tone, after a few moments of silence. "What? What sort of a ghost?" "There, in that room, just at the door, I seemed to see a ghost." "Whose ghost?" asked Velchaninoff, pausing a minute before putting the question. "Natalia Vasilievna's." Velchaninoff jumped out of bed and walked to the door, whence he could see into the room opposite, across the passage. There were no curtains in that room, so that it was much lighter than his own. "There's nothing there at all. You are drunk. Lie down again," he said, and himself set the example, rolling his blanket around him. Pavel Pavlovitch said nothing, but lay down as he was told. "Did you ever see any ghosts before?" asked Velchaninoff suddenly, 10 minutes later. "I think I saw one once," said Pavel Pavlovitch in the same low voice, after which there was silence once more. Velchaninoff was not sure whether he had been asleep or not, but an hour or so had passed, when suddenly he was wide awake again. Was it a rustle that awoke him? He could not tell. But one thing was evident: in the midst of the profound darkness of the room something white stood before him, not quite close to him, but about the middle of the room. He sat up in bed, and stared for a full minute. "Is that you, Pavel Pavlovitch?" he asked. His voice sounded very weak. There was no reply, but there was not the slightest doubt of the fact that someone was standing there. "Is that you, Pavel Pavlovitch?" cried Velchaninoff again, louder this time. In fact, so loud that if the former had been asleep in bed he must have started up and answered. But there was no reply again. It seemed to Velchaninoff that the white figure had approached nearer to him. Then something strange happened. Something seemed to "let go" with Velchaninoff's system, and he commenced to shout at the top of his voice, just as he had done once before this evening, in the wildest and maddest way possible, panting so that he could hardly articulate his words. "If you, drunken ass that you are, dare to think that you could frighten me, I'll turn my face to the wall and not look round once the whole night, to show you how little I am afraid of you, a fool like you, if you stand there from now till morning. I despise you." So saying, Velchaninoff twisted round with his face to the wall, rolled his blanket round him, and lay motionless, as though turned to stone. A death-like stillness supervened. Did the ghost stand where it was, or had it moved? He could not tell. But his heart beat and beat and beat. At least 5 minutes went by, and then, not a couple of paces from his bed, there came the feeble voice of Pavel Pavlovitch. "I got up, Alexey Ivanovitch, to look for a little water. I couldn't find any, and was just going to look about nearer your bed." "Then why didn't you answer when I called?" cried Velchaninoff angrily, after a minute's pause. "I was frightened. You shouted so, you alarmed me." "You'll find a carafe and glass over there, on the little table. Light a candle." "Oh, I'll find it without. You'll forgive me, Alexey Ivanovitch, for frightening you so. I felt thirsty so suddenly." But Velchaninoff said nothing. He continued to lie with his face to the wall, and so he lay all night, without turning round once. Was he anxious to keep his word and show his contempt for Pavel Pavlovitch? He did not know himself why he did it. His nervous agitation and perturbation were such that he could not sleep for a long while. He felt quite delirious. At last he fell asleep, and he awoke at past 9 o'clock next morning. He started up, just as though someone had struck him, and sat down on the side of his bed. But Pavel Pavlovitch was not to be seen. His empty, rumpled bed was there, but its occupant had flown before daybreak. "I thought so!" cried Velchaninoff, bringing the palm of his right hand smartly to his forehead. Chapter 10 of The Permanent Husband by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The doctor's anxiety was justified. Liza grew worse, so much so that it was clear she was far more seriously ill than Velchaninoff and Claudia Petrovna had thought the day before. When the former arrived in the morning, Liza was still conscious, though burning with fever. He assured his friend Claudia, afterwards, that the child had smiled at him and had held out her little hot hand. Whether she actually did so, or whether he so much longed for her to do so that he imagined it done, is uncertain. By the evening, however, Liza was quite unconscious, and so she remained during the whole of her illness. 10 days after her removal to the country, she died. This was a sad period for Velchaninoff. The Pogoryeltseffs were quite anxious on his account. He was with them for the greater part of the time, and during the last few days of the little one's illness he used to sit all alone for hours together in some corner, apparently thinking of nothing. Claudia Petrovna would attempt to distract him, but he hardly answered her, and conversation was clearly painful to him. Claudia was quite surprised that all this should affect him so deeply. The children were the best consolation and distraction for him. With them he could even laugh and play at intervals. Every hour, at least, he would rise from his chair and creep on tiptoes to the sick room to look at the little invalid. Sometimes he imagined that she knew him. He had no hope for her recovery, none of the family had any hope. But he never left the precincts of the child's chamber, sitting principally in the next room. Twice, however, he had evinced great activity of a sudden. He had jumped up and started off for town, where he had called upon all of the most eminent doctors of the place, and arranged consultations between them. The last consultation was on the day before Liza's death. Claudia Petrovna had spoken seriously to him a day or two since, as to the absolute necessity of hunting up Pavel Pavlovitch Trusotsky, because in case of anything happening to Liza, she could not be buried without certain documents from him. Velchaninoff promised to write to him, and did write a couple of lines, which he took to the Pokrovsky. Pavel Pavlovitch was not at home, as usual, but he left the letter to the care of Maria Sisevna. At last Liza died, on a lovely summer evening, just as the sun was setting, and only then did Velchaninoff rouse himself. When the little one was laid out, all covered with flowers, and dressed in a fair white frock belonging to one of Claudia Petrovna's children, Velchaninoff came up to the lady of the house, and told her, with flashing eyes, that he would now go and fetch the murderer. Regardless of all advice to put off his search until tomorrow, he started for town immediately. He knew where to find Pavel Pavlovitch. He had not been in town exclusively to find the doctors those 2 days. Occasionally, while watching the dying child, he had been struck with the idea that if he could only find and bring down Pavel Pavlovitch, she might hear his voice and be called back, as it were, from the darkness of delirium. At such moments he had been seized with desperation, and twice he had started up and driven wildly off to town in order to find Pavel Pavlovitch. The latter's room was the same as before, but it was useless to look for him there, for, according to Maria Sisevna's report, he was now 2 or 3 days absent from home at a stretch, and was generally to be found with some friends in the Voznesensky. Arrived in town about 10 o'clock, Velchaninoff went straight to these latter people, and securing the services of a member of the family to assist in finding Pavel Pavlovitch, set out on his quest. He did not know what he should do with Pavel Pavlovitch when found, whether he should kill him then and there, or simply inform him of the death of the child, and of the necessity for his assistance in arranging for her funeral. After a long and fruitless search, Velchaninoff found Pavel Pavlovitch quite accidentally. He was quarrelling with some person in the street, tipsy as usual, and seemed to be getting the worst of the controversy, which appeared to be about a money claim. On catching sight of Velchaninoff, Pavel Pavlovitch stretched out his arms to him and begged for help, while his opponent, observing Velchaninoff's athletic figure, made off. Pavel Pavlovitch shook his fist after him triumphantly, and hooted at him with cries of victory. But this amusement was brought to a sudden conclusion by Velchaninoff, who, impelled by some mysterious motive, which he could not analyze, took him by the shoulders and began to shake him violently, so violently that his teeth chattered. Pavel Pavlovitch ceased to shout after his opponent, and gazed with a stupid, tipsy expression of alarm at his new antagonist. Velchaninoff, having shaken him till he was tired, and not knowing what to do next with him, set him down violently on the pavement, backwards. "Liza is dead," he said. Pavel Pavlovitch sat on the pavement and stared. He was too far gone to take in the news. At last he seemed to realize. "Dead," he whispered, in a strange, inexplicable tone. Velchaninoff was not sure whether his face was simply twitching, or whether he was trying to grin in his usual disagreeable way. But the next moment the drunkard raised his shaking hand to cross himself. He then struggled to his feet and staggered off, appearing totally oblivious of the fact that such a person as Velchaninoff existed. However, the latter very soon pursued and caught him, seizing him once more by the shoulder. "Do you understand, you drunken sot, that without you the funeral arrangements cannot be made?" he shouted, panting with rage. Pavel Pavlovitch turned his head. "The artillery lieutenant. Don't you remember him?" he muttered thickly. "What?" cried Velchaninoff with a shudder. "He's her father. Find him. He'll bury her." "You liar! You said that out of pure malice. I thought you'd invent something of the sort." Quite beside himself with passion, Velchaninoff brought down his powerful fist with all his strength on Pavel Pavlovitch's head. Another moment and he might have followed up the blow and slain the man as he stood. His victim never winced, but he turned upon Velchaninoff a face of such insane, terrible passion that his whole visage looked distorted. "Do you understand Russian?" he asked more firmly, as though his fury had chased away the effects of drunkenness. "Very well, then, you are a—" Here followed a specimen of the very vilest language which the Russian tongue could furnish. "And now you can go back to her!" So saying, he tore himself from Velchaninoff's grasp, nearly knocking himself over with the effort, and staggered away. Velchaninoff did not follow him. Next day, however, a most respectable-looking middle-aged man arrived at the Pogoryeltseffs' house, in civil uniform, and handed to Claudia Petrovna a packet addressed to her from Pavel Pavlovitch Trusotsky. In this packet was a sum of 300 roubles, together with all certificates necessary for Liza's funeral. Pavel Pavlovitch had written a short note couched in very polite and correct phraseology, and thanking Claudia Petrovna sincerely "for her great kindness to the orphan, kindness for which heaven alone could recompense her." He added rather confusedly that severe illness prevented his personal presence at the funeral of his "tenderly loved and unfortunate daughter," but that he "felt he could repose all confidence" as to the ceremony being fittingly performed, in the angelic goodness of Claudia Petrovna. The 300 roubles, he explained, were to go towards the funeral and other expenses. If there should be any of the money left after defraying all charges, Claudia Petrovna was requested to spend the same in prayers for the repose of the soul of the deceased. Nothing further was to be discovered by questioning the messenger, and it was soon evident that the latter knew nothing, excepting that he had only consented to act as bearer of the packet, in response to the urgent appeal of Pavel Pavlovitch. Pogoryeltseff was a little offended by the offer of money for expenses, and would have sent it back, but Claudia Petrovna suggested that a receipt should be taken from the cemetery authorities for the cost of the funeral, since one could not well refuse to allow a man to bury his own child, together with a document undertaking that the rest of the 300 roubles should be spent in prayer for the soul of Liza. Velchaninoff afterwards posted an envelope containing these two papers to Trusotsky's lodging. After the funeral, Velchaninoff disappeared from the country altogether. He wandered about town for a whole fortnight, knocking up against people as he went blindly through the streets. Now and then he spent a whole day lying in his bed, oblivious of the most ordinary needs and occupations. The Pogoryeltseffs often invited him to their house, and he invariably promised to come, and as invariably forgot all about it. Claudia Petrovna went as far as to call for him herself, but she did not find him at home. The same thing happened with his lawyer, who had some good news to tell him. The difference with his opponent had been settled advantageously for Velchaninoff, the former having accepted a small bonification and renounced his claim to the property in dispute. All that was wanting was the formal acquiescence of Velchaninoff himself. Finding him at home at last, after many endeavours, the lawyer was excessively surprised to discover that Velchaninoff was as callous and cool as to the result of his, the lawyer's, labours as he had before been ardent and excitable. The hottest days of July had now arrived, but Velchaninoff was oblivious of everything. His grief swelled and ached at his heart like some internal boil. His greatest sorrow was that Liza had not had time to know him, and died without ever guessing how fondly he loved her. The sweet new beacon of his life, which had glimmered for a short while within his heart, was extinguished once more, and lost in eternal gloom. The whole object of his existence, as he now told himself at every moment, should have been that Liza might feel his love about her and around her, each day, each hour, each moment of her life. There can be no higher aim or object than this in life, he thought, in gloomy ecstasy. If there be other aims in life, none can be holier or better than this of mine. All of my unworthy life should have been purified and atoned for by my love for Liza. In place of myself, my sinful, worn-out, useless life, I should have bequeathed to the world a sweet, pure, beautiful being, in whose innocence all my guilt should have been absorbed, and lost, and forgiven, and in her I should have forgiven myself. Such thoughts would flit through Velchaninoff's head as he mused sorrowfully over the memory of the dead child. He thought over all he had seen of her. He recalled her little face all burning with fever, then lying at rest in her coffin, covered with lovely flowers. He remembered that once he had noticed that one of her fingers was quite black from some bruise or pinch, goodness knows what had made it so, but it was the sight of that little finger which had filled him with longing to go straight away and murder Pavel Pavlovitch. "Do you know what Liza is to me?" Pavel had said, he recollected, one day, and now he understood the exclamation. It was no pretence of love, no posturing and nonsense, it was real love. How, then, could the wretch have been so cruel to a child whom he so dearly loved? He could not bear to think of it. The question was painful and quite unanswerable. One day he wandered down, he knew not exactly how, to the cemetery where Liza was buried, and hunted up her grave. This was the first time he had been there since the funeral. He had never dared to go there before, fearing that the visit would be too painful. But strangely enough, when he found the little mound and had bent down and kissed it, he felt happier and lighter at heart than before. It was a lovely evening, the sun was setting, the tall grass waved about the tombs, and a bee hummed somewhere near him. The flowers and crosses placed on the tomb by Claudia Petrovna were still there. A ray of hope blazed up in his heart for the first time for many a long day. How light-hearted I feel, he thought, as he felt the spell of the quiet of God's acre, and the hush of the beautiful still evening. A flow of some indefinable faith in something poured into his heart. This is Liza's gift, he thought. This is Liza herself talking to me. It was quite dark when he left the cemetery and turned his steps homewards. Not far from the gate of the burial ground there stood a small inn or public house, and through the open windows he could see the people inside sitting at tables. It instantly struck Velchaninoff that one of the guests, sitting nearest to the window, was Pavel Pavlovitch, and that the latter had seen him and was observing him curiously. He went on further, but before very long he heard footsteps pursuing him. It was, of course, Pavel Pavlovitch. Probably the unusually serene and peaceful expression of Velchaninoff's face as he went by had attracted and encouraged him. He soon caught Velchaninoff up, and smiled timidly at him, but not with the old drunken grin. He did not appear to be in the smallest degree drunk. "Good evening," said Pavel Pavlovitch. "How do you do?" replied Velchaninoff. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Permanent Husband, by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. By replying thus to Pavel Pavlovitch's greeting, Velchaninoff surprised himself. It seemed strange indeed to him that he should now meet this man without any feeling of anger, and that there should be something quite novel in his feelings towards Pavel Pavlovitch, a sort of call to new relations with him. "What a lovely evening!" said Pavel Pavlovitch, looking observantly into the other's eyes. "So you haven't gone away yet," murmured Velchaninoff, not in a tone of inquiry, but as though musing upon the fact as he continued to walk on. "I've been a good deal delayed, but I've obtained my petition, my new post, with rise of salary. I'm off the day after tomorrow for certain." "What? You've obtained the new situation?" "And why not?" said Pavel Pavlovitch, with a crooked smile. "Oh, I meant nothing particular by my remark," said Velchaninoff, frowning, and glancing sidelong at his companion. To his surprise, Pavel Pavlovitch, both in dress and appearance, even down to the hat with the crape band, was incomparably neater and tidier looking than he was wont to be a fortnight since. Why was he sitting in the public house, then? thought Velchaninoff. This fact puzzled him much. "I wished to let you know of my other great joy, Alexey Ivanovitch," resumed Pavel. "Joy?" "I'm going to marry." "What?" "Yes, sir, after sorrow, joy. It is ever thus in life. Oh, Alexey Ivanovitch, I should so much like it if— But you look as though you were in a great hurry." "Yes, I am in a hurry, and I am ill besides." He felt as though he would give anything to get rid of the man. The feeling of readiness to develop new and better relations with him had vanished in a moment. "I should so much like—" Pavel Pavlovitch did not finish his sentence. Velchaninoff kept silence and waited. "In that case, perhaps another time, if we should happen to meet." "Yes, yes, another time," said Velchaninoff quickly, continuing to move along, and never looking at his companion. Nothing was said for another minute or two. Pavel Pavlovitch continued to trot alongside. "In that case, au revoir," he blurted at last. "Au revoir, I hope—" Velchaninoff did not think it necessary to hear him complete his sentence. He left Pavel, and returned home much agitated. The meeting with "that fellow" had been too much for his present state of mind. As he lay down upon his bed, the thought came over him once more. Why was that fellow there, close to the cemetery? He determined to go down to the Pogoryeltseffs next morning. Not that he felt inclined to go, any sympathy was intolerably painful to him, but they had been so kind and so anxious about him, that he must really make up his mind to go. But next day, while finishing his breakfast, he felt terribly disinclined for the visit. He felt, as it were, shy of meeting them for the first time after his grief. "Shall I go or not?" he was saying to himself as he sat at his table. When suddenly, to his extreme amazement, in walked Pavel Pavlovitch. In spite of yesterday's encounter, Velchaninoff could not have believed that this man would ever enter his rooms again, and when he now saw him appear, he gazed at him in such absolute astonishment that he simply did not know what to say. But Pavel Pavlovitch took the management of the matter into his own hands. He said "Good morning," and sat down in the very same chair which he had occupied on his last visit, 3 weeks since. This circumstance reminded Velchaninoff too painfully of that visit, and he glared at his visitor with disgust and some agitation. "You are surprised, I see," said Pavel Pavlovitch, reading the other's expression. He seemed to be both freer, more at his ease, and yet more timid than yesterday. His outward appearance was very curious to behold. For Pavel Pavlovitch was not only neatly dressed, he was "got up" in the pink of fashion. He had on a neat summer overcoat, with a pair of light trousers and a white waistcoat. His gloves, his gold eyeglasses (quite a new acquisition), and his linen were quite above all criticism. He wafted an odour of sweet scent when he moved. He looked funny, but his appearance awakened strange thoughts besides. "Of course I have surprised you, Alexey Ivanovitch," he said, twisting himself about. "I see it. But in my opinion there should be a something exalted, something higher, untouched and unattainable by petty discords, or the ordinary conditions of life, between man and man. Don't you agree with me, sir?" "Pavel Pavlovitch, say what you have to say as quickly as you can, and without further ceremony," said Velchaninoff, frowning angrily. "In a couple of words, sir," said Pavel hurriedly. "I am going to be married, and I am now off to see my bride, at once. She lives in the country, and what I desire is, the profound honour of introducing you to the family, sir. In fact, I have come here to petition you, sir." Pavel Pavlovitch bent his head deferentially. "To beg you to go down with me." "Go down with you? Where to?" cried the other, his eyes starting out of his head. "To their house in the country, sir. Forgive me, my dear sir, if I am too agitated, and confuse my words, but I am so dreadfully afraid of hearing you refuse me." He looked at Velchaninoff plaintively. "You wish me to accompany you to see your bride?" said Velchaninoff, staring keenly at Pavel Pavlovitch. He could not believe either his eyes or his ears. "Yes, yes, sir," murmured Pavel, who had suddenly become timid to a painful degree. "Don't be angry, Alexey Ivanovitch. It is not my audacity that prompts me to ask you this. I do it with all humility, and conscious of the unusual nature of my petition. I thought, perhaps, you would not refuse my humble request." "In the first place, the thing is absolutely out of the question," said Velchaninoff, turning away in considerable mental perturbation. "It is only my immeasurable longing that prompts me to ask you. I confess I have a reason for desiring it, which reason I propose to reveal to you afterwards. Just now "The thing is quite impossible, however you may look at it. You must admit yourself that it is so," cried Velchaninoff. Both men had risen from their chairs in the excitement of the conversation. "Not at all, not at all. It is quite possible, sir. In the first place, I merely propose to introduce you as my friend, and in the second place, you know the family already. The Zachlebnikoffs. State Councillor Zachlebnikoff." "What? How so?" cried Velchaninoff. This was the very man whom he had so often tried to find at home, and whom he never succeeded in hunting down; the very lawyer who had acted for his adversary in the late legal proceedings. "Why, certainly, certainly!" cried Pavel Pavlovitch, apparently taking heart at Velchaninoff's extreme display of amazement. "The very same man whom I saw you talking to in the street one day. When I watched you from the other side of the road, I was waiting my turn to speak to him then. We served in the same department 12 years since. I had no thought of all this that day I saw you with him. The whole idea is quite new and sudden, only a week old." "But, excuse me, why surely this is a most respectable family, isn't it?" asked Velchaninoff naively. "Well, and what if it is respectable?" said Pavel with a twist. "Oh, no, of course, I meant nothing; but so far as I could judge from what I saw, They remember your coming down!" cried Pavel delightedly. "I told them all sorts of flattering things about you." "But look here, How are you to marry within 3 months of your late wife's death?" "Oh, the wedding needn't be at once. The wedding can come off in 9 or 10 months, so that I shall have been in mourning exactly a year. Believe me, my dear sir, it's all most charming. First place, Fedosey Petrovitch has known me since I was a child. He knew my late wife. He knows how much income I have, he knows all about my little private capital, and all about my new increase of salary. So that you see the whole thing is a mere matter of weights and scales." "Is she a daughter of his, then?" "I'll tell you all about it," said Pavel, licking his lips with pleasure. "May I smoke a cigarette? Now, you see, men like Fedosey Petrovitch Zachlebnikoff are much valued in the state. But, excepting for a few perquisites allowed them, the pay is wretched. They live well enough, but they cannot possibly lay by money. Now, imagine, this man has 8 daughters and only 1 little boy. If he were to die there would be nothing but a wretched little pension to keep the lot of them. Just imagine now, boots alone for such a family, eh? Well, out of these 8 girls 5 are marriageable. The eldest is 24 already. A splendid girl she is, you shall see her for yourself. The 6th is a girl of 15, still at school. Well, all of those 5 elder girls have to be trotted about and shown off, and what does all that sort of thing cost the poor father, sir? They must be married. Then suddenly I appear on the scene, the first probable bridegroom in the family, and they all know that I have money. Well, there you are, sir. The thing's done." Pavel Pavlovitch was intoxicated with enthusiasm. "Are you engaged to the eldest?" "No, not the eldest. I am wooing the 6th girl, the one at school." "What?" cried Velchaninoff, laughing in spite of himself. "Why, you say yourself she's only 15 years old." "15 now, sir. But she'll be 16 in 9 months, 16 in 3 months. So why not? It wouldn't be quite nice to make the engagement public just yet, though, so there's to be nothing formal at present. It's only a private arrangement between the parents and myself so far. Believe me, my dear sir, the whole thing is apple pie, regular and charming." "Then it isn't quite settled yet?" "Oh, quite settled, quite settled. Believe me, it's all as right and tight as—" "Does she know?" "Well, you see, just for form's sake, it is not actually talked about, to her, I mean. But she knows well enough. Oh, how you will make me happy this once, Alexey Ivanovitch, won't you?" he concluded with extreme timidity of voice and manner. "But why should I go with you? However," added Velchaninoff impatiently, "as I am not going in any case, I don't see why I should hear any reasons you may adduce for my accompanying you." "Alexey Ivanovitch!" "Oh, come, you don't suppose I am going to sit down in a carriage with you alongside, and drive down there? Come, just think for yourself." The feeling of disgust and displeasure which Pavel Pavlovitch had awakened in him before, had now started into life again after the momentary distraction of the man's foolery about his bride. He felt that in another minute or two he might kick the fellow out before he realized what he was doing. He felt angry with himself for some reason or other. "Sit down, Alexey Ivanovitch, sit down! You shall not repent it," said Pavel Pavlovitch in a wheedling voice. "No, no, no!" he added, deprecating the impatient gesture which Velchaninoff made at this moment. "Alexey Ivanovitch, I entreat you to pause before you decide definitely. I see you have quite misunderstood me. I quite realize that I am not for you, nor you for me. I am not quite so absurd as to be unaware of that fact. The service I ask of you now shall not compromise you in any way for the future. I am going away the day after tomorrow, for certain. Let this one day be an exceptional one for me, sir. I came to you founding my hopes upon the generosity and nobility of your heart, Alexey Ivanovitch, upon those special tender feelings which may, perhaps, have been aroused in you by late events. Am I explaining myself clearly, sir, or do you still misunderstand me?" The agitation of Pavel Pavlovitch was increasing with every moment. Velchaninoff gazed curiously at him. "You ask a service of me," he said thoughtfully, "and insist strongly upon my performance of it. This is very suspicious, in my opinion. I must know more." "The whole service I ask is merely that you will come with me, and I promise when we return that I will lay bare my heart to you as though we were at a confessional. Trust me this once, Alexey Ivanovitch." But Velchaninoff still held out, and the more obstinately because he was conscious of a certain worrying feeling which he had had ever since Pavel Pavlovitch began to talk about his bride. Whether this feeling was simple curiosity, or something quite inexplicable, he knew not. Whatever it was, it urged him to agree and go. And the more the instinct urged him, the more he resisted it. He sat and thought for a long time, his head resting on his hand, while Pavel Pavlovitch buzzed about him and continued to repeat his arguments. "Very well," he said at last. "Very well, I'll go." He was agitated almost to trembling pitch. Pavel was radiant. "Then, Alexey Ivanovitch, change your clothes, dress up, will you? Dress up in your own style, you know so well how to do it." Pavel Pavlovitch danced about Velchaninoff as he dressed. His state of mind was exuberantly blissful. "What in the world does the fellow mean by it all?" thought Velchaninoff. "I'm going to ask you one more favour yet, Alexey Ivanovitch," cried the other. "You've consented to come, you must be my guide, sir, too." "For instance, how?" "Well, for instance, here's an important question. The crape. Which ought I to do? Tear it off or leave it on?" "Just as you like." "No, I want your opinion. What should you do yourself, if you were wearing crape, under the circumstances? My own idea was, that if I left it on, I should be giving a proof of the fidelity of my affections. A very flattering recommendation, eh, sir?" "Oh, take it off, of course." "Do you really think it's a matter of course?" Pavel Pavlovitch reflected. "No," he continued. "Do you know, I think I'd rather leave it on." "Well, do as you like." "He doesn't trust me at all events, which is one good thing," thought Velchaninoff. They left the house at last. Pavel looked over his companion's smart costume with intense satisfaction. Velchaninoff was greatly surprised at Pavel's conduct, but not less so at his own. At the gate there stood a very superior open carriage. So you had a carriage in waiting, had you? Then you were quite convinced that I would consent to come down with you, I suppose?" "I took the carriage for my own use, but I was nearly sure you would come," said Pavel Pavlovitch, who wore the air of a man whose cup of happiness is full to the brim. "Don't you think you are a little too sanguine in trusting so much to my benevolence?" asked Velchaninoff, as they took their seats and started. He smiled as he spoke, but his heart was full of annoyance. "Well, Alexey Ivanovitch, it is not for you to call me a fool for that," replied Pavel, firmly and impressively. And Liza?" thought Velchaninoff, but he chased the idea away. He felt as though it were sacrilege to think of her here. And immediately another thought came in, namely, how small, how petty a creature he must be himself to harbour such a thought. Such a mean, paltry sentiment in connection with Liza's sacred name. So angry was he, that he felt as though he must stop the carriage and get out, even though it cost him a struggle with Pavel Pavlovitch to do so. But at this moment Pavel spoke, and the old feeling of desire to go with him re-entered his soul. "Alexey Ivanovitch," Pavel said, "are you a judge of articles of value?" "What sort of articles?" "Diamonds." "Yes." "I wish to take down a present with me. What do you think? Ought I to give her one, or not?" "Quite unnecessary, I should think." "But I wish to do it badly. The only thing is, what shall I give? A whole set? Brooch, earrings, bracelet, and all, or only one article?" "How much do you wish to spend?" "Oh, 400 or 500 roubles." "Bosh!" "What? Too much?" "Buy one bracelet for about 100." This advice depressed Pavel Pavlovitch. He grew wondrous melancholy. He was terribly anxious to spend a lot of money, and buy the whole set. He insisted upon the necessity of doing so. A shop was reached and entered, and Pavel bought a bracelet after all, and that not the one he chose himself, but the one which his companion fixed upon. Pavel wished to buy both. When the shopman, who originally asked 175, let the bracelet go for 150 roubles, Pavel Pavlovitch was anything but pleased. He was most anxious to spend a lot of money on the young lady, and would have gladly paid 200 roubles for the same goods on the slightest encouragement. "It doesn't matter my being in a hurry to give her presents, does it?" he began excitedly, when they were back in the carriage, and rolling along once more. "They are not swells, at all. They live most simply. Innocence loves presents," he continued, smiling cunningly. "You laughed just now, Alexey Ivanovitch, when I said that the girl was only 15. But you know, what specially struck me about her was, that she still goes to school, with a sweet little bag in her hand, containing copy books and pencils. Ha ha ha! It was the little satchel that fetched me. I do love innocence, Alexey Ivanovitch. I don't care half so much for good looks as for innocence. Fancy, she and her friend were sitting in the corner there, the other day, and roared with laughter because the cat jumped from a cupboard onto the sofa, and fell down all of a heap. Why, it smells of fresh apples, that does, sir. Shall I take off the crape, eh?" "Do as you like." "Well, I'll take it off." He took his hat, tore the crape off, and threw the latter into the road. Velchaninoff remarked that as he put his hat on his bald head once more, he wore an expression of the simplest and frankest hope and delight. "Is he really that sort of man?" thought Velchaninoff with annoyance. "He surely can't be trundling me down here without some underhand motive. Impossible! He can't be trusted entirely to my generosity?" This last idea seemed to fill him with indignation. "What is this clown of a fellow?" he continued to reflect. "Is he a fool, an idiot, or simply a permanent husband? I can't make head or tail of it all." Chapter 12